Anita Sarkeesian, in 2009 you founded Feminist Frequency. What was the background for that?
Yeah, I started it while I was in graduate school because I was really frustrated with how inaccessible feminist theory was. It was trapped in these ivory towers, and so I really wanted to make something that would allow the public to have access to what I think is really critical information. And so tying it with popular culture and releasing it free on a public platform, I felt like was one of the most accessible ways of being able to make feminist theory more prominent.
And then you started analyzing and publishing videos about female representation in video games.
I did.
And then hell broke loose.
It did.
What happened?
Yeah, so in 2012, I had a Kickstarter that was raising money to create a series of videos that looked at the way women were represented in video games specifically. And just announcing that I was going to do this project released a torrent of hate. So it was a cyber mob that has lasted till this day that includes death threats and rape threats, attacks on all of my social media sites, threats at events that I speak at, and just sort of day-to-day harassment constantly online with anything I say or do.
Were you prepared for that?
No. How would you be prepared for that?
But how is it now? Is it still going on?
Yeah, I think that the conversation around online harassment is so much more prevalent than it was when I was first attacked. I wasn't the first one by any means, but I was one of the first that was really prominent in the news, where international news covered it. So today we see people being attacked all the time, and it's really sad, and it's usually marginalized folks who are being attacked for, just being a woman or just being a woman of color or trans, who might have an opinion, who might have starred in a movie. So I think that it's actually overall, as the landscape, it's actually getting worse.
Yeah. When it comes to the things you found about women in video games, what did you find?
What did I find? I found that it's not good. It's not a great place. So we looked at the history of gaming, and we talked about different tropes, which are narrative devices that are used to tell stories, to make it easy for the audience to understand. Tropes aren't necessarily a bad thing, but they can perpetuate harmful stereotypes. And so that was what we were looking at specifically. And we found that in the history of gaming, it is not great to be a woman. That there's a lot of degrading representations, whether it's damsels in distress or sexual violence, just used as like gritty texture in a game to make it feel like a dark, dangerous world. Whether it's using women's bodies as a reward, there's all kinds of creative ways that developers have made it so that women are in a state of either being degraded or just not present in games. And that is slowly changing, but if the project that we embarked on was very much looking at the last sort of 30 years or so of gaming.
You say it's slowly changing. Are you optimistic about the future?
It depends what day you ask me.
Yeah. Today?
Today. Well, we're in the Norwegian countryside, so how can you be mad about anything? I think that it is very much a case of like one step forward, two steps back. There's some days where we have games that are announced that are really great and exciting and wonderful in terms of showing marginalized voices, marginalized stories. And then there are days where it feels like we're still stuck in the early days of gaming, where it's highly sexualized women, or just like ridiculous representations of women. So I think that in some ways it's both. And that's why this conversation is a little hard to have, because people really want a clear, like, yes, we're moving forward. But that's not how progress works.
Do you think the gaming industry and the games, is it worse than, for instance, in the films?
That's always a tricky one. I think that there are more films, right? Yeah. So quantitatively, there's just more film. Film has been around for a lot longer. It's had a lot more time to grow than games have. I think that games historically have been in the time period that it's been around have been really regressive, and we're only just in the last 5 years even having conversations about that in the way that we've had feminist criticism of film and television for a lot longer than we've had games. So in some ways, yes, I think that games are worse, but I don't think it has to be that way. I think that we are starting to understand games as an art form that deserves reasonable criticism.
The Me Too movement started in the film industry. In what way, or do you think Me Too has changed the situation?
I think that there's something really exciting about the fact that predatory men were publicly called out and that their careers suffered for it. That isn't always the case. We have now been, since the couple years that Me Too was in the headlines starting out, we've seen men who have been accused of predatory behavior just pop back in as if nothing happened. So I think we're at a point where the conversation is happening, that there is, and it's happening not just quietly like it's been happening for years, right? We've been talking whisper networks about, women have been talking to each other about, don't work with that director, don't work with these developers. You know, there were harmful experiences that people had, but they were too afraid to speak up about them. I think there is more of a space now to speak up about it for some people, but you'll notice that we're still prioritizing white women in terms of who's getting credibility, who's like a good victim. Women of color, trans women aren't taken as seriously when it comes to these kinds of issues. And I think it still needs to be, we still have a ways to go in actually having real consequences for these men, right? That like there's been a couple like the Harvey Weinsteins who've been kind of knocked out, but then all these other men are just popping back in as if nothing happened. So, you know, I'm not mad at the increase in conversation and the increase in like awareness around these issues, but it's about time that things move faster in this regard.
When it comes to games, what would you say is the biggest challenge for the future when it comes to women, portrayal of women, or representation of other groups?
So I think the funny thing is that just getting the industry to understand that having female characters in your game is not going to be the end of your studio, right? Like it's not going to be the failure of, you know, it's completely reasonable to ask for different kinds of characters other than the grizzled white dude that we've had for decades, right? That was so hard. That simple thing, very simple thing, was so hard, and so much harassment and difficulties just getting that to be understood. So I think that we're in a place where those conversations are more prominent in development studios now. For me, the next step is really about how do we marry mechanics and narrative? How do we talk about really important, let me backpedal on that one, because it can be important issues, but it can also just be different stories and different life experiences and just different everything, right? So we're not telling the same go to war, shoot zombies, you know, kill Nazis stories that we've been getting, because those are really easy to, like, the industry has mastered shooting. Like, we know how to develop shooters. Like, we know how to make them feel good. It's like, we've got that. So what's next, right? How do we tell stories where the narrative and the mechanics feel cohesive? And I think that's really hard. I think that there aren't a lot of examples, and I think that that is the next big challenge for the industry, which will, I believe, propel better representations if we can figure that out.
Great.
Great. Let's do it.